All right, we'll go ahead and call this work session to order. This is a work session regarding AO 2024-61, amending AMC 4.60 to establish the accountability board for the child care and early education fund. So with that, we'll start with introductions.
Mark Littlefield.
Cameron Perez-Verdia.
Scott Myers.
Anna Brawley.
Meg Zalatel. Mr. Solt, are you on the phone with us?
Randy Schultz here.
Awesome. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Mr. Constant is excused. So with that, I think for today, I'm going to turn this over to the sponsors to kick us off. And then we will make sure we leave plenty of room for questions around the ordinance. And if the sponsors could remind us when this is coming back before the body, I think that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll give a brief overview, and then I also want to invite Mr. Eric Croft up. He was one of the advocates who helped get Proposition 14 passed, which dedicated marijuana tax funding and also created this board. So I also want to point folks to, we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but what you have on paper is AO 2022-17 S2 as amended, and that is basically the language that was put before the voters, passed in 2023, and is now in the charter. So really, I just want to ground us first in the fact that this is fundamentally implementing a piece of Proposition 14 in our charter so that there can be this board that the voters approved to create to make recommendations or be advisory on the best use of marijuana tax funding, which is now dedicated to early childhood and early childhood education and childcare. So that's where we started. So also, I just want to point folks to if whatever we do needs to be compliant with this in the charter, right? So that's one piece. And then the second one is, before we get into the content, timing. And so to answer the Vice Chair's question, this item is on our agenda for June 25th. So it's our next meeting. It was introduced in May with the idea that it would be out there for the public to review for about 30 days. I haven't seen any comments myself on it, but I will, of course, point members of the public to this ordinance. It is AO 2024-61. And then in terms of timing, also, just to remind folks, so the idea, we had a work session a few weeks ago. We had the kind of update from the implementation team for what's called the ACE Fund, the Anchorage Child Care and Early Education Fund, ACCEE, we'll just say ACE Fund. And really the process that group is moving forward on as far as funding recommendations. So the goal is that group, of which Cameron and I are a part, and Eric is as well, and others, is to bring forward the best package of recommendations we can to hand to this new board, the accountability board. And I'll also note accountability board is what was in the charter language. That's why we're using it. And so that's moving forward. And then the goal is to, as quickly as possible, as long as we get this ordinance right, pass the ordinance, get this board in place, and then that allows the incoming administration, given the timing, to appoint board members. So the goal is to ideally, if everything works out, to have these board members seated by the end of the summer, early fall, and then it will be a short opportunity, but they will have some opportunity to give the mayor and the assembly recommendations for use of this dedicated funding. And of course, the backup is if for some reason we take more time with this, or there's a delay. Obviously, there's lots of priorities at the city, right? So this is just one of many. If that doesn't happen, this board will still be created, but the timing is such that the funding recommendations that come from the implementation team may be what we have, right, if there is no board yet. So I just want to also say that. So there is some urgency as far as timeline, but also there is a plan B that the implementation team has talked about, because the goal long-term is this board is having that function. They are doing that advisory work, and the other functions potentially that are written in here. But also we do have a plan for the 2025 budget, but we hope that there's an opportunity for them. So with all of that said, I think where we want to go before we get into kind of walking through the policy policy items in the ordinance is, I think it'd also be helpful to hear from both Mr. Perez-Verdia and Mr. Croft, who were kind of involved in this earlier than I was, and maybe just kind of talk about big picture what the intent of this board is, and then we can get into the specifics and kind of talk through the choices that were made in this ordinance with the implementation team's input.
Before we shift, I just want to note for the record, Mr. Martinez has joined us on the phone. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll just say that we've spent some great deal of time, I think, talking about context and history and how we got to where we are. But I think it would be helpful just have a brief. Eric, do you want to just share just a little bit of brief of the sort of the genesis of this and how we got to where we are now?
Yeah, thank you, Eric Croft. It was an idea that had been somewhat floating around. It had become clear in COVID, sort of, I've heard COVID described as a tide that washed out and left things that were there, but submerged, exposed. And so one of the things COVID exposed was how fragile and piecemeal our early education and childcare system is. The original idea was that it might fund pre-K, but it was pretty quickly recognized that pre-K was just an extension of the need of childcare and almost a subset of it. But you'll see that tension to some extent in this now. It's trying to do both and recognize that it doesn't have the resources quite to solve either problem completely, pre-K or childcare more broadly. What was clear, and to some extent it was informed by some of the frustrations some of the participants in the alcohol tax had about the way decisions were made about the alcohol tax. So it was intentionally designed with a fair amount of autonomy for this board. When it got to the assembly to some extent toned that back, and that was an appropriate political process. The assembly has the power to do that and also involve the supporters, the providers of childcare and others that were pushing for this. So I think what you see before you, as often happens in politics, is a compromise that leaves some questions unanswered that now I think we're at the time where we have to answer them. It is clear that in what was put before the voters and approved by a substantial margin and put in the charter. So we're bound by the charter. And that language does say that the board hires what they call a principal executive officer, that the board proposes the budget, but that the final authority to finalize the budget lies with the mayor and the assembly. The original proposal that came to the assembly had even more autonomy than this, had a budgetary autonomy for the board, and that was compromised or wrapped, if you will, into ordinary process. And it's clear that all the net proceeds have to go to these purposes. It also stated, and this was added by the assembly, that this board is to prioritize the use of existing school district facilities that are targeted for closure or being closed, as long as it's economically feasible. So those are mandates from what's now our governing constitution, the charter. But what it punted to some extent for discussion now is the exact nature of the division of authority between the mayor and the board, and to some extent the balance between childcare and early education, pre-K, that the board and the assembly want to do. So it came from a real need. It came from a public source. The assembly considered it, approved it, but on the process made some changes that made it, without eliminating its autonomy, made it at least budgetarily more within the general structure. I would say, attending a lot of these meetings, and I've seen people struggle with, well, what board is this like? Like which model should we use? What provision of code that already exists do we copy for this? And I just say part of the glory of, part of the fun of, part of the reason municipal government often works better than state or federal is because it can be very innovative. And we have all kinds of different models in just our little municipality here, from sort of almost full autonomy of the port to boards that really are acting more as judges, the Board of Equalization, and then its various change natures. Like, we have a lot of different structures that we have the freedom under Alaska's constitution to experiment with. And so this doesn't necessarily have to be like any other thing. It was meant to be a little different. We have the parking authority. We have all kinds of different structures, and this is one that feels a little different too. But so I think we're at the point where this AM and this AO are trying to be specific about some of the things that were legitimately left open, and that is to some extent the exact division of authority between a board that was meant to be powerful and heard, but within the budget process as well, and a balance between childcare and early education, with a fund that generates 5 and hopefully growing. I have every confidence in the people I grew up with that the marijuana receipts will continue to increase. People I went to high school with, but it's at about 5 million net now.
Thank you, Mr.
Thanks.
Croft. I want to note for the record, about 10:30, we were joined by Ms. Bronga in the room and Mr. Rivera on the phone. Go ahead, Mr. President.
Yeah, and I think, and I can sort of tag team this. I think the goal for today is really just to make sure that there are all questions are answered, so that we can walk through generally the pieces and parts of this, and to provide as much clarification to members as we can, so that we are successful in passing this when we get to the dais. And I would just say that the based on my many conversations with members and others, sort of the key questions center around the composition of the board, which is B, the responsibilities of the board, which is C, and then a few questions have emerged around F, which is the staffing and how that will work. But happy, Anna, do you want to walk through each piece of this briefly, and then we can just open it up for questions? Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and then I'll try to keep it brief, but also if there's clarifying questions too before we move on to the next section, we can do that. I'm starting on page 2 here, and then I'll just note there's most of the policy choices are going to be in these couple sections, as Mr. Perez-Verdia said, and then there's a few other places where this board needs to be slotted into code. So we'll focus on what this board does. So section 1 establishes the board. You'll note it has no sunset provision because it is in the charter. So some boards don't have sunsets, a lot of them do. So that's, not really a big policy choice, just noting it there. Section 2 really, again, talks about the purpose of the board. Some of this came directly from the charter language or modified version of, as Mr. Perez-Verdia said, section B under here subsection B talks about it's a 9-member board. And then I'll just note, some of this is standard board language. We talked broadly about how basically we want to see diverse representation on this board, and there's multiple ways to define that. One is making sure the board looks like our community. So you'll see there's some broad language there, because we also talked about how specific to get in defining, do we have every seat being designated? What are the rules that we have, and how do we balance flexibility? Because it can be hard sometimes to fill really specific seats, but also making sure that we don't see, for example, a board full of 9 childcare providers, right? Because then their recommendations are probably going to skew toward something that benefits them. So trying to balance the interests, the perspectives, and then of course making sure that we have that consumer perspective, the parents or folks who have kids in the system that have that perspective too. So the way we solve that, and again, all of this is up for debate, obviously. Board composition, we talked about that broad representation. That is intended to really just give the mayor, who would be making these appointments, and then the assembly confirms that broad intent. And then saying, the way that we did this was basically making sure there's at least one of these various perspectives recommended, and then having a cap on, as I said, the kind of the the sector side, so folks who are actively employed in that sector, early education or childcare. So you see at least one and not more than 4. At least one will be employed or retired from a social services profession, including behavioral health, wanting that healthcare perspective. At least one member will be a parent or guardian. And then you'll see there's 9. That doesn't add up to 9. So it's really saying, here's the baseline of what you have to have on the board, but there's flexibility. So, but there's different ways. We talked about that. We talked about having terms. This says there's a term limit of 3 consecutive terms. Their terms are 3 years. So it's kind of like the assembly. And the goal there was really to make sure that that there is turnover on this board over time. You know, we don't contemplate the same person serving for 20 years. So again, that's a policy choice. Section C talks about the responsibilities. Most of these were directly adapted from the ballot measure. And then I'll note there's kind of 2 pieces that we should be clear about. One is the budget process. And I think that's one where the charter language is very clear. This board is advisory, and there is, a broad process laid out for this board to make those advisory recommendations. They feed into the budget process, and then ultimately mayor and assembly decide. But that's really the first part of their responsibility. The second part that Eric has alluded to is really, what do they do outside of that budget process? You know, how much are they involved in the grant making process, in reviewing, reviewing data showing the outcomes from these grants, right? There's all these pieces that are written in. It does say may, and so these are things that that they can do, right? So what it says that they do have certain responsibilities. Sorry, I think I misspoke. So that one does say shall, but really looking at what does the accountability piece mean? You know, what responsibility do they have there?
I have a question on that. So it does say may under C, and limit, but not limited to those listed.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's number 3, right? Number 3 really looks like the administration of the fund. So how does that, if that exists in this piece of code, how does that get activated or not? Who makes that call? Would that be delegation of the implementation by the administration to the board? Is that what's contemplated there? Or is that a policy call for the assembly, or is something else, a third option potentially contemplated with that?
Yeah, I can answer that briefly, and then others should weigh in. I think the charter does not mandate those things, so that's why we said may. And what we were thinking was, how can the board best do its job? So what information does it need to have available? And then how is it interacting with the other side of it, and what we talked about with alcohol tax, where we want to report back to the public, that we're doing. So sorry, to respond to the question, the way this solves that question is the charter contemplates that executive director, staff person, or chief executive officer is the term, I believe, or principal executive officer. And so the idea would be that they would have one or more staff people, and that's one of the questions really is it its own entity? Is it just working with the typical department staff who support the board, like health department?
We're missing my question, I think, which is, this is permissive. So how does permission get given for the board to potentially do the implementation, the solicitations, give the grants out? So what's the mechanism that allows that permission? Is it again, a policy choice by, like, something that's required by the assembly to pass, that we pass a resolution saying, board, go forward and do the implementation of this fund? Or is the administration able to say, we think the best capacity for administering this fund is through the board and the board staff? Because it's a may. And so how is the permission given?
I think I'm understanding your question, and I'll see if I can find it. I think this is a conversation we've been having ongoing, is how does this work? I think that the board having a clear framework for priorities and how funding decisions are made is our intention to have that established, so that there is a clear understanding of what the priorities are and how these funding decisions are made in terms of their recommendations, that they fit within that framework. And so the executive principal officer works to organize the information, manage the sort of incoming in information, so that at the end of the day, this board can make a recommendation for funding based on that framework. But then the mechanism of actually getting the funding out and managing those grants would not be with this board. I don't think this board actually manages the day-to-day implementation of these grants. They oversee that. And so that this is the piece that I think is important for us to discuss, is that once the board says, here's our funding recommendations, here's the budget we want to put forth, and here are the priorities and decisions we made, that's approved, then they don't have the capacity to actually manage these grants. I think that has to be done through the administration.
Okay, then, yeah, that language isn't clear then in 3, because it does say make procurement and grant award decisions. And then there's the reference to Title VII. So I just want to think through that a little bit more. Ms. Bronga?
Thank you. I'm a little confused, and I think you may have explained it, but I didn't get it. So the preamble for C, or whatever you call that first part, says may, but then when you get down in 3, it says shall. And so I think that needs to be
Where's
cleaned up. Shall, it's right there.
Okay.
And so is that section shall, and the other part, the other tasks are may? That probably needs to be cleared up. And then I personally wanted to throw out on B, C, I would love to see at least 2 members, parent or legal guardians, using childcare. So those are your experts for sure on what's happening in that arena.
Yeah, so I appreciate that, and I think this is part of the discussion to be had, is that the role that this board plays in making decisions about who ends up with the funding. That I think the vision is that this board would have a great deal of say in where those funds go, and that but the ultimate decision about the release of those funds has to go through the assembly. We have to approve the budget. And so I guess when I read this, and I think it's helpful, we may want to change some of this language, but that this board is involved in reviewing requests, reviewing solicitations, and ultimately making the recommendation of who should be funded. Once those funding decisions are made, then the management of those grants would need to be done through the administration.
Thanks, but that's not what your language says. And this is where I'm stuck. It says, and grant award decisions. So right now, for instance, we did this, we specifically gave, we tried this with the alcohol tax when we gave Alaska Children's Trust, a grant-making organization, a chunk of money, and we let those grant decisions rest with the Children's Trust, right? Typically, those grant decisions would come back to us to approve those grant agreements. This does not require that. So the entities, so we may make the budgetary decisions, and if it's bucketed, not to specific line item people because we contemplate a competitive process, we get no final say then as to who those grants go to. And that is, except in this limited time when we've done it with the Children's Trust, which was a fairly extraordinary circumstance and not without a lot of heartburn. That's different. That's very different for us. And so I'm kind of, is that what that says? Because that's how I read it. And if that's not what it says, then I think we need clarity. I understand the Title VII piece of getting the money out the door. That's one thing. But will there be a secondary appropriation step for us, right? We will appropriate the money per the budget. Will we then approve the grant agreements that meet those thresholds under Title VII? So something to think about.
Yeah.
All right. Nobody else in the queue if you want to keep going.
Yeah, I'll keep going. And then I'll also note, we kind of went, I guess, the broadest extent in this ordinance, saying, okay, we're contemplating if this board and their staff had what is the maximum number of responsibilities, I guess they would have. And so we're totally open to, what that actually looks like. So then the rest of that section C really outlines, a lot of it is really, we want to make sure we're coordinating with the school district, with the municipality, other entities, external entities, right? So putting that in there. So that would be defined by the board, but really how they want to engage. And because all of that is supposed to be a continual feedback process to make sure that we're funding things with impact and best practices and all of that. And that's really a lot of the research work that the implementation team is handing the board to work from as a starting point. But over time that would change. So section D, budget and funding. Most of this just lists the charter, but we also contemplate, this is again, the board may take these actions for budgeting. They could adopt their own written policies. They could adopt a strategic investment plan. That is not specifically what the the implementation team is providing. It's not going to be a plan. But really a lot of research and recommendations, but they could turn it into a plan in the future. One note, we have at least one public hearing annually prior to adopting their budget recommendations. And the thought there was not to be really prescriptive, because this board can come up with its own process, but that they would have at least one public hearing to vet their recommendations prior to them moving forward. So again, just building in that accountability or conduit for the public, in addition to the fact that all of their meetings will be public because they're like other boards and commissions. And then they're supposed to prepare this annual budget. So that is one of their core functions. Talks about expenditures. That's really boilerplate. Saying that they need to be providing information to the public. Section F talks about staff. Again, the charter language says that they may appoint, so it doesn't require, but that they may appoint a principal executive officer. The way that this was written in was really modeled on the Anchorage Equal Rights Commission. And I know Dean, Mr. Gates, who's not here today, shared that. Like, he was looking at that as a model, because the direction we gave was, how do we keep this board, as Eric said earlier on, somewhat independent. But that is obviously a conversation. Does this live within an existing department? Does it become its own little office that's like the Equal Rights Commission? That's really the best analog we have. And then the last section G here is definitions. And then I'll just note section 3, 4, 5, and I'm just making sure. And 6 that's really around putting this staff person in the other parts of code that they need to be in. And then lastly, I just want to point to section 7 on the last page, and that's transitional measures. This was also an area that we had conversation actually yesterday with Katie Skovic, the incoming chief of staff for the LaFrance administration. Until such time the executive officer is employed, it would be the muni manager, health department, and legislative services office, some combination of those, to provide staff support, arrange for workspace, assist with the procurement and hiring, et cetera. So really just thinking, this is where this would live in the meantime. And so this is also up for discussion. There's an argument this should or should not be in code itself, right? And then this is also something we can just simply leave to the administration to decide. But I just want to highlight, because that is a relevant section. And I think that's it.
Okay, Ms. Branca.
So your last comment there about the hiring decisions, but on page 5, up at the top on 3, it says pay per diem costs, but shall not pay salary. So who's being paid for? Is someone else that's not on the board that's doing administrative function? I'm sorry.
Yeah, thanks. That would be the executive director. So the idea is the board, and the board is not the one hiring, but they would have input on the decision. And of course, recognizing that would take time, even if the intent is to have an executive director as soon as possible, they wouldn't be hired immediately. So, yeah.
Mr. Littlefield.
Yeah, on the cost for the executive director, is that coming out of the taxes we're getting from the marijuana tax? 10%?
Yeah,
I think I read that earlier.
Yeah, the administrative cap is 10%.
Thank you.
Thank you. My question on that section around the executive director, this feels a lot like the ACDA director and board structure. Is that a fair corollary where the executive director is, or is it a little bit different because the board hires the executive director? Like, I just need some to ground it in either it is like ACDA or not.
I mean, the language clearly says that the executive director serves at the pleasure of the board.
Sure.
So the
but is there any mayoral or mayoral appointment or assembly confirmation in process here at all, or is it 100% independent?
I think this is partly the discussion, but this is a discussion we had earlier, is that ultimately the assembly approves the budget. And I think that gives them the ability to oversee any spending decisions by this board. So if one of the spending decisions is a hiring of an executive director or principal officer, that seems like that would fit within that as well.
Okay, so it is different than ACDA because ACDA is a two-step process. We both confirm the director of that organization, and there is a board though, and we also approve their annual budget, and then any final expenditures under Title VII, and those additional grant agreements and expenditures under Title VII also come back to us. So this one feels like it has more autonomy as to who, and then later those specific grant agreements as it is written now. The overall structure will look and be like, oh, okay, yeah, those administrative fees are within the 10% and are completely reasonable, and whatever information is given. But that would be the full limitation of the assembly's involvement
The budget.
as the ordinance is currently written.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's how I read it anyway.
Yeah, and then I'll point out too, on the bottom of page 6, this is just one example where it was modeled on Equal Rights Commission. It talks about non-represented employees, and then it inserts, in addition to the Equal Rights Commission executive director, that they're appointed, terminated, and paid in a manner determined by that board. And I think it says in consultation, somewhere else it says in consultation with the mayor. So yeah, really contemplating that the board is choosing that staff.
Interesting, in consultation with the mayor, but then not us. So that, again, it feels a little weird and lopsided compared to all the other ways in which we've structured that relationship between the two branches of government. All right, other questions? Oh, yeah, go ahead, Cameron.
I'm processing a little bit out loud. So as it's currently written, the role of the assembly throughout this is budgetary oversight, right? And there's nothing written in there that gives the assembly any other control, if you will. And the other, I want to go back to a previous comment about sort of the process. So that you talked about the Alaska Children's Trust and the approval of funding in particular priority areas, but then having another organization go through the process of the solicitations and all of that. And I think that, again, this is something that we're still needs to be clarified here. But if this board had an active principal officer and had staff that had the ability to work with the health department and others to go through the process of identifying who might be the recipients of that staff, that could still come through the process to the budget to the assembly. So that currently the assembly in this sort of setup would only approve, for instance, sort of like priority allocations in these buckets. I could imagine in this case that is more refined as it comes to the assembly in a budget form, in actually, here is the 23 organizations that this board intends on funding, and here are the amounts that it intends on funding. Towards.
Oh, that's interesting. So the timing could be such that they have the opportunity to go through a process early enough so that when the full budget comes through, it could be line item to the organizations because it's already gone through a Title VII compliant process of solicitations. You've gotten it all in the queue.
That
would be
that's
novel.
Possible.
It'd be great.
I mean, if it's possible, but partly it's, and I'll hand over to you, is the intention of having staff and an executive director. I think it envisions that this board is partnering and leveraging and working with these childcare and early education organizations, so that is done in a more intentional and effective way.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think big picture, some of the questions as far as, what goes in this ordinance, this is really where the group was talking as well, right? Like how how many powers or how much authority do we explicitly give the board in code? Whether it's a shall or a may, how expansive is that? They are allowed to hire an executive director, so we felt it was important to write that in as an option. It doesn't say shall. The charter doesn't say shall, and neither does this. And then also recognizing the practicality of rolling this out, right? There's got to be some kind of interim plan. So I think the question is really, how much do we put in code? How prescriptive do we be in code, or expansive in terms of what they're allowed to do? And then how much of that is something that we do put in code versus leaving to the administration to figure out? So like I said, we had a conversation yesterday that incoming admin is also reviewing this ordinance, so they haven't weighed in specifically, but had some reservations about creating a separate office. But I think the bottom line is, one option is to say, here's the board, here's the composition, here's the more traditional powers and duties it has, and then hand all of that decision making off. Or do we try to craft it collaboratively with the admin in advance and then put more of those rules in there? That's kind of where I'm at.
All right, thank you. Mr. Croft?
Yeah, so just on the Assembly's role, I mean, it has broad authority over this process. First of all, every member of the board has to be approved by the Assembly. Secondly, the charter amendment makes clear that it has the final budgetary authority. So all the board really is doing is suggesting a budget, and the board is approving it. And then it also has very broad language in B. The Assembly shall establish by ordinance the board's responsibilities, composition, and operation, which is kind of what we're doing here today. And on specifically Chair Zalatel's question on the final approval of those grants, it always frustrated me on the Assembly that after giving budgetary authority, then we were voting on a host of small approvals with the budgetary authority the Assembly had granted, now they want to go buy 5 whiteboards. And I had to say, yeah, on the consent agenda. Well, just, you can put in here, grants award decision subject to Assembly approval, and it can come back in the same way it does if the health department had done it. That is, you give either the board or the health department authority to spend 10 million or whatever, it's not gonna be 10, 2 million on grants for childcare that do these things. And then they do that process and they come back and they say, now approve the grant. And there's nothing in this that prohibits, even if the board did it. So the board did that operation, they came back and they say, here are the grants we did with your authority. You can say, and we approve those. As you do the purchase of a tractor by DOT.
Okay.
Or
Okay.
equivalent.
Yeah, I really liked your idea, Mr. Perez-Verdia, that it can just get so far ahead, right, in its work, and know that it really just all comes as part of a budget. So not only here is the amount we've budgeted for the year, but we've gone through a solicitation process or we are doing multi-year solicitations. And so therefore we would recommend, right, it's continuation or something like that. One additional question from me, and just something to think about. I appreciate that you have an interim plan. I think that's really important. I also think metering expectations about the interim plan and the final plan. As we know, there become expectations of grantees of funds for year over year, like continuation budgets. So it's just something that would have to be really clear that anything funded, possibly in the first year, this would be one times. And then, as the board got set up, it would go through this process. So I think, and I really I wrote down, one of the advantages I look at with this board in particular is leveraged funding. How do you braid and leverage the various opportunities out there? And then how does this board become possibly also a part of our legislative program and advising us on the missing pieces of legislation or the funding at the state level? The municipality isn't going to solve the child care and early education crisis on its own. And so someone or an entity that is thinking long and hard about this all year long, that can advise us at those key points, I think is really important. And I would really like to, and I'll look at the language to see if we can't specifically get some language in here that the board and the organization would advise us for that purpose, because I am thinking about it, but I'm not thinking about it as long and deep and as hard as these folks will be. So that's the other part of the leveraging, is not just the money, but the advocacy and the policy work.
Just as the response to that briefly, just in this process of working with the implementation team and the many childcare providers and parents and early learning experts who've been involved in the development of this, it's been amazing to see what we've learned through that process. And one of the things that has emerged is all these other organizations that are working on the same thing. And I'll give a good example. The Cook and the Tribal Council has dedicated millions of dollars now to investing in early learning and child care. And many of us were not aware of that, but because of the outreach to all of these organizations and people, we learned about that. And so there's an opportunity to leverage the millions that could come from this fund and the millions that would come from that particular organization. And there are others. And so I think having a dedicated board and person not only working on identifying where these funds should be spent, but also looking at how to leverage the funds is a really important role of this.
Any other questions? Any questions from the phone? Yeah, go ahead, Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, and of course, if there's questions on the phone, I can defer. But just to remind folks, as far as timeline, this is coming up on the 25th. We have already been, we knew after this work session that we would likely have an S version. So we are going to work on that based on some of the feedback we heard. And of course, if you have additional feedback, you can provide it to Jennifer, who's our staff person working on this. And also, feel free to, of course, prepare amendments and so on. So we're going to work on getting an S version on the addendum, just so folks know. This is really helpful conversation. And again, I think the question is really how much of, what is the scope of authority or powers or contemplated possible powers that this board should have in code? We can always come back and change it later, of course. And then also how much do we want to kind of prescribe where this should sit versus leaving some of those questions unanswered is another option. And then it's really left up to the administration. And so that's where I would say. And then, of course, board composition, we didn't talk as much about that, but made a note about what Ms. Bronga said, or as far as more parent representation. And then if other folks have thoughts on that or missing perspectives or other ways to do that, please bring them to the table.
All right, I'm not seeing anyone else in the queue. Any last thoughts? All right, well, thank you so much. Thanks for all the work on this. This has really moved forward. And so this will be, AO 2024-61, adding a new chapter and amending sections of code to establish the accountability board for the Child Care and Early Education Fund, and a principal executive officer will be before us on the 25th of June. Thanks. We'll be adjourned.